My father-in-law said I would regret not fighting for the marriage in court. I didn't argue. I presented documented financial discipline, protected investments, and enforced the prenup terms. Their confidence shifted when the settlement left her responsible for her own liabilities. You're going to regret this. Walking away without a fight? That's not a man. That's a coward. Those were the exact words my father-in-law, Victor, said to me across a restaurant table while his daughter sat beside him, arms crossed, not even bothering to look me in the eye. I set my coffee cup down slowly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flinch. I just said, "Okay, Victor, let's see how this plays out." And that was the last civil conversation the three of us ever had. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. I was 34 years old when my marriage ended. Not when the divorce was finalized, when it actually ended. Those are two very different moments, and most people who've been through it know exactly what I mean. My wife, Nicole, and I had been together for 6 years and married for 3. We lived in a mid-sized city in the Pacific Northwest, both of us working professional jobs, both of us building what looked, from the outside, like a very clean, very organized life. Except it wasn't. The first sign that something was off came about 8 months into the marriage. Not a dramatic scene, not a fight, not even a raised voice. It was a Tuesday evening. I came home to find Nicole on the phone, talking quietly in the bedroom with the door mostly closed. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that she stopped talking the moment she heard my keys hit the counter. I didn't say anything about it that night. I filed it away. You should know something about me before we go any further into this story. I am, by nature, a documenter. It's not paranoia. It's not some calculated scheme I had running from the moment I said, I do. It's just how my brain works. I keep records. I track numbers. I save receipts, statements, screenshots, and email threads, not because I distrust everyone around me, but because I spent 5 years in financial compliance before moving into private consulting, and the habit became second nature. My laptop has folders within folders within folders. My phone's camera roll is organized by month and category. I'm the guy who reads the full terms and conditions before signing anything. Yes, I know. I'm a lot of fun at parties. But that habit, that obsessive, sometimes annoying habit, is the reason I'm sitting here today writing this instead of losing half of everything I'd spent a decade building. Back to the marriage. Nicole was smart, ambitious, and genuinely funny when things were good. She worked in marketing at a mid-level agency, made decent money, had a strong social circle, and knew exactly how to present herself in any room she walked into. We met through mutual friends, dated for 3 years, and I proposed because everything seemed to make sense. That's a strange way to describe falling in love, I know. But looking back, making sense was probably my first warning sign. Love isn't supposed to just make sense. It's supposed to feel like something. Before the wedding, I brought up the prenuptial agreement. This was not a spontaneous decision. I had significant assets going into the marriage, a paid-off condo, a diversified investment portfolio I'd been building since my mid-20s, a consulting business with real equity, and a small commercial property I co-owned with my business partner. I was not wealthy by any stretch, but I was financially stable in a way that had taken enormous discipline to achieve. Nicole had considerably less. Not zero. She had savings, a car, and some personal investments, but the gap was significant. I told her clearly and calmly before we got engaged that a prenup was a condition of getting married, not a negotiating point, a condition. She didn't love the idea. She brought it up with her parents. Her mother, a fairly reserved woman named Diane, didn't say much. Her father, Victor, had plenty to say. Victor was one of those men who'd built a modest amount of success in the construction business and wore it like it was a suit of armor. He was confident, loud, and accustomed to being the most authoritative voice in any room he entered. He called me personally the week after Nicole and I had the prenup conversation. You know what that says to my daughter? He told me. It says you're already planning to leave her. I told him that's not what it said at all. I told him what it said was that both of us were entering the marriage with clear eyes about what we each brought to the table and how things would be handled if the relationship didn't work out. He didn't like that answer. Marriage is about faith, he told me. Faith and commitment, not contracts. I said, Victor, I have tremendous faith in Nicole. I also have a lawyer. He hung up. Nicole signed the prenup. Her own attorney reviewed it. I insisted on that, paid for it myself, and she signed. The terms were straightforward. Assets I brought into the marriage remain mine. Businesses I owned or co-owned prior to the wedding remain mine. Investments started before the marriage remained mine. Jointly acquired assets during the marriage would be split equitably. Debt incurred individually during the marriage remained the responsibility of whoever incurred it. Spousal support was capped, time-limited, and only applicable if the marriage lasted more than 5 years. We hadn't hit 5 years. For the first 2 years, the marriage was fine. Not perfect, not movie-level romantic, but functional and mostly good. We traveled a couple of times a year. We had a shared household account that we both contributed to equally. We maintained separate personal accounts. Her idea, actually, which I had no objection to. We had a group of friends we both enjoyed. We argued occasionally, made up, moved on. Normal. Then her job situation changed. The agency she worked for lost 2 major clients, restructured, and her role was significantly downsized in terms of both responsibility and compensation. Nicole took it hard. I understood that. Losing professional identity is genuinely painful, and I didn't minimize it. I told her to take the time she needed to figure out her next move. I told her our expenses were covered. I told her I had her back. And for a while, I thought we were navigating it together. What I didn't know was what was happening during that figuring it out period. This is where the story starts to get complicated. And this is also where my documentation habit starts to matter. About 4 months after her position changed, I noticed something odd in our joint household account. We'd set it up so both of us contributed a fixed amount monthly to cover rent on a second property we'd leased together, utilities, shared subscriptions, groceries, and other household costs. The contribution amounts were equal. My deposits were consistent to the day. Nicole's had started coming in late, then lighter, then 1 month, not at all. When I brought it up, she said she'd had a slow month and would make it up. She did make it up the following month. I let it go. 2 months later, the same thing happened. I noticed it, noted it quietly, and asked about it. She got defensive. Not apologetic, not embarrassed, defensive. "You're tracking my deposits?" she asked. I said, "It's a shared account. I track all the deposits." She said, "That feels controlling." I said, "It's a shared financial responsibility, Nicole. This isn't controlling, it's basic accounting." The conversation ended there. She made the deposit 2 days later. I kept the record of the conversation. Here's the thing about patterns. They don't announce themselves. They just keep repeating until you've collected enough data points to connect them. Over the next 8 months, I started noticing other things. Nothing explosive. Nothing that would make a dramatic headline on its own. Just quiet, accumulating inconsistencies. She'd mentioned looking at a new car, but hadn't discussed a purchase with me. Then a new car appeared in the driveway. Financed, not paid for. In her name only. I didn't object to the purchase. I did note that she'd taken on a monthly liability without a conversation. Her personal spending increased visibly. New clothes, regular salon visits, a weekend trip she took with a friend that was described as already budgeted, which was interesting since I'd never seen the budget it was supposedly accounted for. None of this was, on its own, a marriage-ending issue. People spend money. People make purchases. People take trips. What concerned me was the absence of transparency in a marriage that had started with a conversation about financial clarity. The bigger revelation came 7 months before the end. I was organizing our tax documents. I do this every year, obsessively, months before they're needed, and I pulled up a summary of our joint account transactions going back 18 months. What I found was a pattern I hadn't seen in full because I'd only been looking at it 1 month at a time. Nicole's contributions to the joint account had been declining, inconsistently and quietly, for over a year. In total, over 18 months, she had contributed roughly $11,000 less than her agreed share. The math wasn't complicated. The implication was clear. I had effectively been subsidizing our shared lifestyle, while she quietly redirected whatever money she had elsewhere. I didn't confront her immediately. I know that sounds calculated, but it wasn't calculation so much as caution. I wanted to understand the full picture before I had a conversation I couldn't unhave. So I kept watching. I kept documenting. I kept being normal at home. Dinner, weekends, conversations about nothing in particular. And over the next 6 weeks, the picture got clearer. Nicole had started spending significant time with a coworker from a new freelance contract she'd picked up. His name was Derek. He was a graphic designer, apparently quite successful, considerably more social than me, and very present in Nicole's new professional circle. I want to be careful here because I'm not going to speculate about what their relationship was. What I can tell you is what I observed and what I documented. Frequent late evenings. Texts at unusual hours. A shift in how she talked about her day, or rather, a shift toward not talking about her day at all. A gradual emotional withdrawal that had a very specific timeline. I'm not a jealous man by disposition. I've never gone through a partner's phone. I've never hired anyone to follow anyone. That's not who I am. But I am observant. And what I was observing told a story I wasn't in a position to ignore. I made an appointment with a divorce attorney. Not to file. Not yet. Just to understand my position. I walked into that office with a folder of printed documents, a USB drive with organized files, and a very calm demeanor that apparently impressed the attorney, a sharp woman named Ms. Caldwell, who'd been practicing family law for over 2 decades. She looked through my preliminary documentation for 20 minutes. She looked up at me and said, "You're in a better position than most people who walk through that door." I said, "I'd like to understand exactly how strong that position is." Ms. Caldwell walked me through everything. The prenup was well drafted and clearly enforceable. Her review confirmed what my original attorney had structured carefully. The financial records I had documented the underpayment to the joint account in a way that was clear and chronological. My premarital assets, the condo, the investment accounts, the business equity, were clean, separately held, and had not been commingled with marital funds in any way that would complicate their protection. The commercial property was held in a business entity with my partner, which created an additional layer of separation. She told me that if Nicole attempted to claim a portion of those assets in a divorce, the documentation I had would make that extremely difficult for her. She also told me something I hadn't fully considered yet. The car loan she took out, Ms. Caldwell said. "That's in her name only?" "Yes," I said. "And the credit cards you mentioned, those are personal, not joint?" "Correct." She nodded slowly. "Under the prenup terms and applicable state law, those liabilities stay with her." I sat with that for a while. I went home. I made dinner. I watched Nicole come in at 9:15, say she'd eaten already, and go to the bedroom. I washed my own dishes. I made a decision. I told Nicole I wanted to separate. No dramatic scene. No accusation. I sat across from her on a Sunday morning with coffee on the table and told her calmly that I believed our marriage had run its course and that I thought it was better for both of us to acknowledge that rather than keep pretending otherwise. She stared at me for a long time. "Is this because of Derek?" she asked. I said, "This is because I've watched our marriage deteriorate for over a year, and I don't think either of us has genuinely tried to stop it." She didn't argue with that. I think that surprised both of us. What came next was a week of quiet, awkward coexistence while she processed, and I waited. Then she called her parents. And then Victor called me. "You don't just walk away from a marriage," he said on the phone, his voice carrying that particular weight of a man who's never been seriously questioned. I said, "I'm not walking away impulsively, Victor. I've thought about this for a long time." "You haven't fought for it," he said. "If you'd fight for it, go to counseling, put in the real effort, this could be saved." I said, "I'm open to that conversation with Nicole directly. This isn't a conversation I'm having with you." He shifted tactics immediately. "You know she's entitled to a fair share of what you've built together." There it was. I said, "She'll receive exactly what she's entitled to under the terms we both agreed to before we got married. Nothing less." He said, "Courts don't always honor those prenups, you know. Judges have discretion." I said, "I'm aware. My attorney is also aware." Long pause. "You already have an attorney." "I've had one for a while, yes." Another pause. "I hope you understand what you're starting." I said, "Victor, I understand it very well." The formal separation process began about 3 weeks after that call. Nicole retained an attorney, a man named Mr. Holloway, who had a reputation for being aggressive in asset division cases. I had no doubt that Victor had either recommended him or paid for him. Probably both. Miss Caldwell was not concerned. "Aggressive attorneys make noise," she told me. "Let's make sure we respond with documentation." Their first move was what I expected, a challenge to the prenuptial agreement. Their argument was that Nicole had signed under pressure, without full understanding of its implications, and that the terms were unconscionably favorable to me. I handed Ms. Caldwell the file I had built, and it was the invoice showing I had paid for Nicole's independent attorney review before the signing. And it was a letter from that attorney confirming Nicole had been counseled on all terms and signed voluntarily. And it was a timeline showing the prenup discussion had begun 4 months before the wedding, not in some rushed, pressure-filled window. Their unconscionability argument collapsed inside of 2 weeks. Their second move was a claim for a share of my premarital investment portfolio. The argument was that some of the returns generated during the marriage had been influenced by marital decisions and joint lifestyle stability. That argument was creative, I'll give them that. Miss Caldwell didn't even break a sweat. My investment accounts had been in a managed portfolio structure since before I met Nicole. The investment decisions were made by a portfolio manager. I had 3 years of statements showing zero marital contributions to those accounts. Nicole had never once deposited anything into or withdrawn anything from those accounts. The accounts were titled solely in my name throughout the marriage. The argument was dismissed. Their third move came from a different angle. They argued that the commercial property, while technically held in a business entity, had appreciated significantly during the marriage and that Nicole was entitled to a portion of that appreciation as a marital asset. This one required a bit more work. My business partner, a careful and methodical man named Conrad, and I spent 2 evenings putting together a paper trail that documented exactly how and when the property value had grown, what business activities had driven that growth, what capital we had each contributed post-marriage, and how Nicole had no involvement in any of it. Conrad also provided a written statement confirming that Nicole had never contributed capital, labor, or decision-making to the business or the property. That argument also failed. Then they came after the joint account shortfall. This was where I think they expected me to be quiet. They must have assumed that if Nicole had been underpaying the joint account, I either hadn't noticed or wouldn't want to raise it because it would seem petty. They were wrong on both counts. I had 18 months of transaction records. I had the original agreement we'd both signed. Yes, I had made Nicole sign a 1-page document when we set up the joint account outlining the equal contribution arrangement, because that's exactly the kind of person I am. I had a calculated total of the shortfall with dates and amounts. I had copies of text messages where Nicole acknowledged the late payments and said she would make them up. The total, including interest calculated at a conservative rate, was just over $13,400. That number went into the settlement calculation. Miss Caldwell and I had one very strategic conversation about how to handle the car loan and Nicole's personal credit card debt. Nicole had accumulated, by our calculations, approximately $28,000 in personal debt during the marriage. The car loan accounted for most of it. The rest was spread across 2 credit cards in her name only. Under the prenup terms and state law, debt incurred individually during the marriage was the responsibility of the party who incurred it. I had not co-signed anything. I had not benefited materially from any of it. The debt was hers. Ms. Caldwell made sure that was crystal clear in the settlement documentation. There was a mediation session about 5 months into the process. Nicole was there with Mr. Holloway. I was there with Miss Caldwell. Victor had apparently tried to attend and been told by the mediator that only parties and their counsel were permitted in the room. I imagine he didn't take that well. The mediation was 3 hours long. Nicole was composed at the start. By the second hour, she was less composed. Not emotional. Exactly. More like gradually deflating. Every time Mr. Holloway raised an asset claim, Miss Caldwell set a document on the table. Every time he argued the prenup shouldn't apply, Miss Caldwell set another document on the table. Every time he suggested I had an obligation Nicole wasn't receiving, Miss Caldwell explained, clearly and without drama, exactly what my obligations were and confirmed they were being met. By the third hour, Nicole was staring at the table. Mr. Holloway was still talking, but he'd stopped looking confident. The mediator asked Nicole directly, at one point, if there was a specific asset or term she felt strongly about outside of what had been discussed. Nicole looked up, glanced at me briefly, and said, the condo. The condo I'd bought 6 years before we even met. The condo I'd paid off 3 years before our wedding. The condo that was documented, titled, and protected 7 ways from Sunday. Miss Caldwell slid a single document across the table. It was the title history. Nicole's name had never appeared on it. No marital funds had ever been used for it. The mortgage had been retired before the marriage. Nicole looked at Mr. Holloway. Mr. Holloway looked at the document. He shuffled his papers. He said, we'll revisit this category. He never revisited it. After the mediation, I stepped outside to get some air. Nicole followed me. She didn't have to. I didn't ask her to. She just came outside and stood a few feet away, both of us looking at the parking lot. After a moment, she said, you were ready for all of that. I said yes. She said, you've been ready for a while. I said, I've been careful for a while. There's a difference. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "My dad thinks you've been planning this from the beginning." I said, "Your dad thinks a lot of things." She made a sound that was almost like a laugh. Almost. She went back inside. The settlement was finalized 6 weeks after mediation. It was not what Victor had predicted. It was not what Mr. Holloway had been promising Nicole in whatever conversations had been happening on their side. What Nicole received from the marriage was the following: an equitable share of assets that had been jointly acquired during the marriage, primarily furniture, shared household items, and a small joint savings account we both contributed to for a planned trip that had never happened. A cash settlement reflecting the appreciated value of contributions she could document from the joint account period. Zero claim to the condo, the investment portfolio, the business equity, or the commercial property. What Nicole left the marriage with were the following: her car, along with the full balance of the loan she'd taken out to finance it. Her personal credit card balances. No spousal support, because the marriage had not lasted the 5-year threshold specified in the prenup. The moment the paperwork was signed and the settlement was recorded, I received a phone call. It was Victor. I answered. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to hear what he had to say. Maybe I was just done avoiding it. He said, "I want you to know that what you did to my daughter is something I'll never forgive." I let him finish. Then I said, "Victor, I followed every term of an agreement that your daughter reviewed, understood, and signed before we got married. I documented everything honestly. I didn't hide assets, I didn't manipulate the process, and I didn't leave her with any responsibility that wasn't already hers. If the outcome feels unfair to you, I'd suggest examining what expectations you and Mr. Holloway set for Nicole before the process began." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You think you're so damn smart." I said, "I think I'm organized, Victor. That's all." He hung up. I sat back in my chair and felt something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite satisfaction. It was more like exhale. Just a long, quiet exhale. I want to take a moment here to address something, because I know there are people reading this who have a version of the obvious question forming in their heads. Was this all just cold and calculated? Was there any actual grief in any of this for me? Here's my answer, and I'll try to make it honest. Yes, there was grief. Not in the way I expected, and not for the reasons I expected, but it was there. I didn't grieve the dramatic version of a marriage ending. The screaming fights, the shattered dishes, the tearful confessions. We never had that. What I grieved was the quieter version, the realization, over months of documentation and observation, that the person I had committed my life to had stopped being a partner somewhere along the way without ever telling me. That the financial drift wasn't just about money. That the late texts and the half explanations weren't just about a friendship. That the word "we" had stopped meaning what it meant on the day we got married, and neither of us had said it out loud. I grieved that genuinely. I grieved it while I was organizing spreadsheets and filing records and meeting with my attorney, which is probably the least romantic way to process the end of a marriage, but it's what I had. The paperwork closed on a Thursday. I went home to the condo. My condo. I made dinner. Nothing elaborate. Just pasta, just a glass of wine, just the specific kind of quiet that comes after a very long and very exhausting chapter finally ends. I sat at my kitchen table and thought about what comes next. Not dramatically. Not with some sweeping emotional revelation. Just practically, the way I tend to think. What do I do with the spare room? Should I repaint? Do I still want to keep the lease on the second property or consolidate? Should I revisit my estate documents now that my beneficiary designations need to change? Very romantic inner monologue, I know. But that's me. That's genuinely me. What I did not do, despite the settled outcome and the protected assets, was feel like I had won something. That framing, winning a divorce, is one of the most corrosive lies people tell themselves coming out of these situations. You don't win a divorce. You survive it. You protect yourself if you were smart enough to prepare. You recover your footing. And then, if you're lucky and you're patient, you eventually look back at the whole thing and understand what it was actually teaching you while it was happening. For me, the lesson wasn't about prenups, though prenups are excellent, and every financially unequal couple should have one, full stop. The lesson wasn't about documentation, though that too is something I'd recommend to literally every adult human being regardless of relationship status. The lesson was something quieter. It was this: clarity costs nothing up front and everything if you wait too long. The prenup conversation felt uncomfortable. The joint account agreement felt unnecessary. The separate asset titling felt overly cautious. Every single one of those things felt like overkill in the moment. Every single one of them mattered enormously later. I thought a lot about Victor's words. You'll regret not fighting for the marriage. The assumption in that sentence is that fighting means what he thought it meant. Lawyers posturing, assets disputed, a courtroom drama where love is the prize and the best performer wins the jury's sympathy. That's not what fighting for something looks like to me. Fighting for something means building it carefully, protecting it honestly, and being willing to let it end with integrity when it becomes clear it cannot be saved. I didn't fight in the courtroom. I had already done my fighting in the spreadsheets, in the prenup conversations, in the years of financial discipline that meant when this moment came, I wasn't scrambling to protect what I'd built. Victor wanted a man who would argue loudly. He got a man who had already done the quiet work. Nicole and I have not spoken since the papers were signed. I don't hold resentment toward her, which surprises me a little when I stop to examine it. I think the documentation process, the years of tracking, the slow accumulation of evidence that things weren't right, actually served an unexpected emotional function for me. By the time we got to the settlement table, I had already processed most of it. The grief had come in pieces, quietly, over months of watching the data confirm what I'd suspected. There was no sudden devastation on signing day. The devastation had happened gradually, in private, while I was doing other things. What I do think about sometimes is the version of this story where I hadn't been careful, where the condo had been retitled jointly 2 years in because it seemed like the natural thing to do, where I'd co-signed the car loan because we were married and that's what spouses do, where the investment accounts had been consolidated into a joint portfolio because it was easier to manage, where the prenup had been skipped because Victor's voice in my head said it was a sign of insufficient faith. In that version of the story, the outcome is radically different. In that version, I'm splitting premarital assets I spent a decade building. I'm absorbing a portion of debt I never incurred. I'm arguing in court about the commercial property my business partner and I poured years into. I'm walking away from a 3-year marriage having paid, effectively, for the privilege of having been in it. That version of the story exists for a lot of people. I've heard from some of them. And I'll say this carefully. I'm not better than the people who find themselves in that version. I'm not smarter. I'm not more emotionally evolved. I was just told early in my career, by a mentor who'd watched colleagues go through devastating divorces, that financial clarity in a relationship isn't a sign of mistrust. It's a sign of respect. Respect for yourself and for the other person. Because ambiguity doesn't protect anyone. It just creates space for different people to form different assumptions about the same situation. And when things go wrong, those conflicting assumptions become the battlefield. Victor called one more time, about 3 weeks after the settlement was finalized. His voice was different this time. Less aggressive. More tired. He said Nicole was struggling with the debt obligations and had asked if I would consider a one-time adjustment to the settlement. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, Victor, the settlement was reviewed by both attorneys and signed by both parties. There's nothing to adjust. He said, she's your wife. I said, she was my wife. The marriage is over. She's in a difficult spot. I understand that. It's a spot she created. Long pause. Then, to his credit, he didn't argue further. He just said, all right, and hung up. I think that was the moment Victor understood that the confidence he'd had coming into this, the confidence that his daughter's attorney could outmaneuver me, that the prenup would fall apart, that the courts would be sympathetic, that I would eventually soften. That confidence had been built on the assumption that I hadn't prepared. He understood now that I had been prepared for years. Not vindicatively, not with malice, just quietly, patiently, completely. Miss Caldwell sent me a handwritten note after the settlement closed. It said, simply, most people who come to me unprepared. It's a pleasure to work with someone who takes their own interests seriously. I kept the note, because that's who I am. A few things I want to say directly to anyone in a similar situation, not as advice, not as judgment, just as things I wish I had heard sooner. A prenuptial agreement is not a pessimistic document. It is a clarity document. It says, here is what each of us is bringing in. Here is what we agree belongs to whom. Here is how we'll handle it if things go wrong. That conversation, no matter how uncomfortable, is infinitely less painful than having it through attorneys years later under adversarial conditions. If someone in your life, a parent, a future spouse, a well-meaning friend, tells you that asking for financial clarity before a marriage means you don't fully believe in it, you are allowed to respectfully disagree. Because people who fully believe in their marriages have those conversations anyway. They have them because they respect each other enough to be honest about what each person carries. Keep your records. I know this sounds strange and paranoid and not at all romantic. Keep them anyway. Not because your partner is the enemy. Not because you're already planning an exit. Keep them because life is genuinely unpredictable, and you will never regret having documentation that proves what happened in your own financial life. Title your assets correctly. Understand what joint means before you put your name on something. Read the financial documents you sign, not because you expect them to matter, because you'll be very glad you did if they ever need to. My condo is quiet these days. I repainted the living room. Actually, went darker than before, a deep muted blue that I like a lot more than the beige Nicole had insisted on when we moved some of her things in. I kept the good furniture. She took what was hers and left what was jointly acquired without a fight, once the settlement made clear the terms. I've been working more. I've been sleeping better than I have in 2 years. I had dinner with Conrad and his wife last week and spent an entire evening talking about nothing more serious than whether a particular restaurant in our neighborhood was going to survive the new competition nearby. It was an extraordinarily normal evening. It was perfect. I've thought about whether I'd do anything differently. Not legally. Legally, I'm satisfied with how every piece of it played out. I mean, personally, would I have had the harder conversations sooner? Yes. I think I let things accumulate because I was more comfortable with documentation than confrontation. I'm better at building a file than I am at sitting across from someone and saying, "I've noticed this and it scares me, and I need you to tell me what's happening." That's a real thing about me that I'm not particularly proud of. The situation was protected financially, but it probably could have been resolved emotionally sooner, in one direction or another, if I'd been willing to be less measured and more honest about what I was observing in real time. Whether that conversation would have saved the marriage or just ended it earlier, I genuinely don't know. But it would have been more honest. And I think I owe myself the acknowledgement that I valued precision over vulnerability for a long time, and that cost me something, even if it wasn't something the spreadsheets could track. I'm telling this story now because I've had 3 conversations in the past year with people I know, a former colleague, a friend of a friend, someone in my building, all of whom walked into divorces utterly unprepared and walked out of them with significantly less than they'd walked in with. Not because they were naive, not because they were foolish, because no one had ever told them clearly, your relationship and your finances are 2 separate things, and being kind to one doesn't mean being reckless with the other. You can be a loving, committed, fully present partner and still have a prenup. You can trust your spouse completely and still keep your premarital investments separately titled. You can believe in your marriage wholeheartedly and still keep a record of your financial contributions to the household. None of those things contradict each other. The story that they do, that financial clarity is somehow the enemy of romantic faith, is a story that benefits people who want to take advantage of your discomfort with having the conversation. Don't let anyone make you feel naive for being organized. Don't let anyone use the language of love to pressure you out of protecting what you built. Victor told me I'd regret not fighting for the marriage in court. I want to close by addressing that directly. I didn't fight in court. I didn't need to. The fight had been in the years of discipline that meant my assets were clean. The fight had been in the uncomfortable prenup conversation that had happened before we ever said our vows. The fight had been in the documented records that answered every claim before it could land. The fight had been in the attorney's office, quietly, 8 months before the filing, when I walked in with a folder and a USB drive and said, "Tell me exactly where I stand." That was my version of fighting. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't make for a compelling courtroom scene. But when the settlement was signed and the documents were filed and the process was over, I walked out of that marriage with my condo, my investments, my business equity, my property, and my financial future intact. Nicole walked out with her freedom, her car, and the debt she'd chosen to carry. Both of us got exactly what the agreement we'd both signed said we would get. That's not a victory. That's just what fairness looks like when you build it in advance. I don't know what Nicole's life looks like now. I hope she's managed the debt. I hope she found work that makes her feel like herself again. I hold no particular bitterness about any of it. She made choices that prioritized her own interests, and I prepared for exactly that possibility. We're even, in a way. She thought she knew what kind of man she was dealing with. She had some of it right, and some of it wrong. She knew I was quiet. She knew I was steady. She knew I was organized. What she miscalculated was that quiet and organized doesn't mean unprepared. It just means I'd already done the work before she thought to look. Victor, if you ever somehow come across this, I want you to know something. I don't disrespect you. You were trying to protect your daughter, and I understand that impulse even if I disagreed with every tactic you used. But the lesson you taught me, unintentionally, by every loud phone call and every confident dismissal, was that the people who talk the most about fighting are usually the ones who prepared the least. Confidence without documentation is just noise. And I was never just noise. The condo is warm. The investments are growing. The business is doing well. And I'm sitting here in my repainted living room, in the quiet I earned, thinking about all of it with the kind of clear eyes that only come after the fog of a long, slow ending has finally lifted. I don't regret any of it. Not the prenup conversation. Not the documentation. Not the careful, meticulous, relentless preparation that Victor called cowardice. What I regret is simpler and more human than any of that. I regret that I married someone I couldn't talk to honestly about money while we were still in love. I regret that the financial clarity I'd built around the marriage was never matched by the emotional clarity inside of it. I regret that somewhere in the middle of all those spreadsheets and records and carefully organized files, I forgot to also build a map to the conversation we should have had 3 years earlier. But that's the work for next time. And unlike last time, I'll be ready for that too. For everyone asking in the comments about the prenup specifics and how to find an attorney who handles this kind of work, please consult a licensed family law attorney in your jurisdiction. I can't give legal advice. What I can tell you is that the prenup conversation is worth having, the independent attorney review for your partner is worth paying for, and the discomfort of the conversation is worth nothing compared to the clarity it creates. Do the uncomfortable thing early. Future you will be grateful.